the security architecture of the Baltics completely changed for Russia. I mean, before Russia could play the sort of Finland and Sweden on one side, NATO on the other side. But now, Finland and Sweden got in very quickly. They're being integrated very quickly into the NATO command and control structures. There's been NATO exercises. I mean, we've got the JEF, of course, which we spoke about, which also is sort of related. So I think the Russian problem there is greatly complicated. The Russian Baltic Fleet now no longer has the same degree of freedom of operation as it had before.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are talking to former UK Defence Attache to Moscow and Kyiv, John Foreman. A Royal Navy veteran, he's had military diplomatic appointments in the US with NATO and the EU and served on global maritime operations. John Foreman, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you again.
Hello, Kate.
We are talking in the days after the Eagle S, a 20-year-old vessel, is suspected of having tried to damage the S-Link 2 power cable between Finland and Estonia. This case is being attributed potentially a Russian ship, hailed as a breakthrough, though, because of the decisive and quick response by the Finnish authorities. Can you bring us up to date and tell us how you see what's happened here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's been 3 or 4 allegations of Russian linked vessels or Chinese vessels cutting underwater infrastructure in the Baltic. I think the interesting one about this one was that it happened inside Finnish waters, and therefore the Finns had jurisdiction, Finnish territorial waters. And because they had jurisdiction, that means that the Finnish could take action. In comparison to the Ling Yang, which took place in November last year, the incident was meant to happen south of Sweden, in Sweden's economic zone, but not in its territorial waters, and therefore precluded immediate action by the police authorities. So I think it's very interesting how the Finns have reacted decisively, taking custody of this vessel, brought it in, and actually conducting a proper investigation. And I think that's the difference from the previous examples, when there's been allegations of this sort of underwater activity by Russian-linked organised vessels, is that this time we actually have a chance to really get into the detail of it. And I think the Finns have been very careful not to set too many hairs running. They've squashed some of the rumours that this vessel was doing spying, whatever. And I think we can all do with waiting for the Finnish investigation to deliver results.
And why do you think they may actually get further where others haven't in the past?
Well, I think if you compare it to the Chinese example, the Chinese vessel, the Yingpeng in November, which was also involved, accused of cutting links between Finland and Germany, or Gotland and Lithuania, it wasn't inside territorial waters. It then went through the Straits of Denmark. It anchored. China allowed some form of investigation, limited, but then the ship went on its way. I think this time is different. It's actually the Finns are going through it with a fine-tooth comb, not just the vessel's seaworthiness, but also investigating where the anchor may have dragged over the cables. So the question is, was it deliberate or was it an accident? And as I said, there's 150 to 200 incidences of cables being cut worldwide annually. I dug out the details, so there's 40 or 50 similar cables, both energy-related and data-related, under the Baltic. So the Baltic's a very congested area. There's lots of ships. Accidents happen. So we have to sort of be clear whether this actually was deliberate or whether it was an accident. And of course, it hasn't stopped people jumping on the bandwagon to say that it is the Russians, but I think we have to be very, very clear before we attribute blame to them, and then determine what we're going to do about it next.
And as you say, people do jump on the bandwagon. They do point the finger, and Russia is prime suspect a lot of the time. Could you, though, just put this into context and explain to us? I mean, the word dark fleet is often bandied around at this time. Can you just explain to us what Russia's history, and before that the Soviet Union's history, is in using scientific or research vessels for potentially more subversive or threatening purposes?
Yeah, sure. I think there's 2 issues here. I mean, firstly, there's this shadow or dark fleet, which is involved in sanctions busting. And, looking at data, in the world of tankers, 75% are fully legal and 25% are sort of quasi-legal or completely illegal. And there's been dark ships or shadow fleet ships running around the world breaking sanctions for years, linked with Iran and Venezuela. I think this use of these shadow fleets has obviously increased since 2022 and sanctions came onto Russian oil. So that's one side of it. And then you have these sort of, Russia's desperate to get its oil to market. It's using these ships, these older ships of differing ownership and sort of very masking their movements to actually get around sanctions. So I think it's one side. And then the other side, of course, is that Russia has a very long history of underwater research. It has specialized submarines. It has specialist bits of the Russian military, which have done that since the 1960s and 70s. And of course, here we see the two things crossing over. You have the sort of professional military side carry on doing research in the North Atlantic, in the North Sea, and perhaps in the Irish Sea and the Baltic. And then on the other side, you have the shadow fleet, which may or may not be involved as well. So again, it's difficult to work out whether this is at the behest of the Russians, and then they found a new way of using a proxy to conduct underwater attack, or whether it's an accident, or whether it's sort of another country, perhaps China, doing work on behalf of the Russians. So again, it's all very murky.
And that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because you mentioned Iran, you've mentioned China, you've mentioned Venezuela and Russia, of course. I mean, is there any coordination or cooperation between these countries in these kinds of activities, do you suspect? Or are they, do you think, working independently to their own interests?
Well, again, the incident in November with the Chinese happened immediately after Biden authorized use of ATACMS missiles against targets inside Russia. And then the incident on Christmas Day was of one of this grey or shadow fleet old tankers shipping oil. I think that's what we hope that the Finns will be able to get to the bottom of, is who are these ships? Who are the crews? What were people told to do? Were they told to do it? But well, the Russian intelligence links, I think we don't know. And I would hope before we start taking action against, in the Baltic and North Sea, that actually get some evidence, and hopefully the Finns will be able to provide that, because before we didn't get much. And the incident, which was back in October 2023, another Chinese ship, the new Polar Star, there was a Finnish and Estonian investigation then. Some people, the Estonians were quite clear it was sabotage. The Americans said it wasn't. So there's different views, and I think it's still a bit too early to say whether there's a massive plot worldwide or whether it's just a sort of set of coincidences that have come together to portray the idea there's a plot.
In response to this latest incident that we've been talking about, the Finnish incident, the UK-led operation has been launched to track and monitor threats to underwater infrastructure, as well as the Russian shadow fleet. What can it do exactly, and where does the law stand on when you can or cannot intervene?
Well, I read the statement by the British Defence Secretary John Healey, who said the UK is, quote, greatly concerned about Russian interference of critical underwater infrastructure, whether that's both by sabotage, or whether it's by negligence or by incompetence. And the Estonians, there was a previous statement by the British, the French, the Polish, and the German defence minister, foreign minister, saying that Russia was systematically, quote, attacking European security architecture. So there's obviously a concern. There's a threat there. I was pleased to see the Joint Expeditionary Force operation launched. There was a feeling, I think, by some that the JEF was sort of losing its way slightly as NATO and the European Union stepped into the space of protecting critical underwater infrastructure.
So just sorry to interrupt, John, but just to explain to people who don't know what the JEF is, it's a Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a collection of 10 nations, isn't it, working together?
Yes, so the Joint Expeditionary Force was set up in about 2012, was to provide a sort of spearhead element, should we say, for NATO, because the problems in NATO decision-making, and the JEF was there between these nations, primarily in the Northern Baltic area, to provide an expeditionary force outside Europe. And I think over time, as the threat has come back onto Russia, the focus has come back onto Russia to actually provide security and stability in the Baltic area. And I was on that JEF exercise myself in November in Latvia, which were very much looking at the sort of scenarios which is now being played out. So I was pleased to see this Joint Expeditionary Force have a focus. It's launched a joint response option in the past to do with protection underwater infrastructure. The fact that it's launched this surveillance and information exchange project using AI to try and track these shadow vessels in the Baltic, I think, is a good start. But of course, there's lots of overlap now between the Joint Expeditionary Force, NATO, who's got a new headquarters there, NATO wanting to send ships there. The European Union's got a role because of the links between the various European Union countries now in the Baltic. So it's quite a murky area. But I think this British led Jeff stepping up and actually doing something will hopefully provide more clarity on the threat.
It's interesting. It's called Nordic Warden, isn't it? I mean, you're saying it's going to use AI to track activity. I mean, what will it actually do with that information? Because there are limits on what can actually be done with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it said information sharing, coordination, providing situational awareness. I mean, again, it gets back to that problem of who is doing what, where, when, and how. To try and not just track stuff, but actually predict it by looking at the various vessels or the shadow fleet. We're talking perhaps 600 ships which are involved in the shadow fleet of using or shipping Russian oil. That's a huge number. A lot of those ships are coming in and out of the Baltic because that's one of the routes that Russia gets its oil to market, which Russia was desperate to do. So if you can use technology, AI, to actually not just retrospectively look where the ships were, but predict and actually provide heads up and warning to others, I think that might help focus the attention of both the civilian side and the military side about where these vessels are. I mean, the problem we've got is that the huge amounts of underwater infrastructure and we can't protect everywhere. So the more you can do to focus effort onto where the threat may be, that will actually help, I think, raise our deterrence by denial, our defences.
Just another example. I'm just wondering, the end question after telling you about this example is really, is it time for NATO and European members to be much more on a Cold War footing about all of this? Because an example was quoted to me this week of a research vessel, the Yantar, intercepted in the Irish Sea, reportedly deploying drones near vital subsea energy and internet cables. And the response was to send a mine hunter vessel and then eventually a frigate. And this is a former Royal Navy officer who said it's time to stop wringing our hands and saying, oh dear, what should we do about it? Maybe this may, and actually be a much more proactive. Do you agree with that opinion?
I've been in the Navy a long time. I was in the Navy a long time. And we knew that the Russians had a long-standing, military campaign against deep NATO infrastructure. I mean, but initially it was against the underwater surveillance systems that the US had placed to track Russian submarines, and then obviously the Russians have used these systems to place their own sensors and also to prepare in extremis of sabotage against energy, communications, and data infrastructure because of our dependence on that. But I think there is a realization in NATO that this has become much more of a focus and task. There's a new underwater centre, NATO. You're talking about NATO about sending ships into the Baltic to help protect our infrastructure. So I think there's a time beyond just tracking, as we said, wringing our hands on this incident, and actually seeing what we're going to do about it. But the problem you've also got is that these ships operate in international waters. So your jurisdiction, even in the Irish Sea, when you're not inside Irish or British territorial waters, is limited. You can track it and you can work out what's going on. But also, I think the fact that the Royal Navy has bought 2 Royal Fleet auxiliary ships to conduct undersea research itself shows that the sign that this is going to be an area of investment. I'm sure it's going to appear in the Strategic Defence Review as an area of focus.
Which is being carried out in the UK into the future of the armed force in the UK at the moment. The Baltic, and you mentioned it's being cited as one of the areas of great risk at the moment. It's dubbed a NATO lake because it's surrounded by NATO member countries. Do you think that is the area of greatest concern?
Well, I think since 2022, since Finland and Sweden joined NATO, the security architecture of the Baltics completely changed for Russia. I mean, before Russia could play the sort of Finland and Sweden on one side, NATO on the other side. But now, Finland and Sweden got in very quickly. They're being integrated very quickly into the NATO command and control structures. There's been NATO exercises. I mean, there's got the JEF, of course, which we spoke about, which also is sort of related. So I think the Russian problem there is greatly complicated. The Russian Baltic Fleet now no longer has the same degree of freedom of operation as it had before. I think it's an area of focus. Is it the only one? I mean, for the British, I would say it's probably less of a focus than we say the North Atlantic. Traditionally, that's where our threat vector is from. But I think the fact that NATO has set up new headquarters, there's more exercising going on now. It is an area of focus. But of course, the people in the south will say the Black Sea is an area of focus, so is the Mediterranean. So I think the wider issue, of course, is that NATO is not just a continental alliance, it's a maritime alliance. The maritime security is as important as continental security. And for us, for the British in particular, maintenance of the transatlantic bridge between the United States and Europe is of actually critical fundamental importance to us.
Let's talk about another Russian so-called problem. Russia has shut down gas supplies to Transnistria. This is a largely Russian-speaking breakaway territory sandwiched between Ukraine and Moldova. This comes after Ukraine ended an agreement with Russia to allow the transit of its gas via Ukraine to the EU. Is this a direct response to Ukraine withdrawing this contract, ending this contract with Russia? And what are they trying to do exactly?
I mean, firstly, I'd say, the way the Russians have portrayed this as the Ukrainians shutting the gas off, I think you're quite right to frame it. This is the end of the transit agreement. And we've seen over the last 2.5, 3 years, the ending fundamentally of Russia's dominance of the European gas market. And the Russians overestimated European dependence on gas. And in fact, the Europeans overestimated their own dependence on Russian gas. So it's been a great degree of weaning Europe off the sort of the teat of the Russian cheap energy, which is sort of sustained, industry, whatever. I think for Transnistria, it shows Russia is quite happy to throw its client states under the bus for geopolitical influence. I mean, the target of cutting the gas off to Transnistria is not Transnistria, it's Moldova. We saw last year how close the elections were. The election of the new president, quote, the new pro-EU president. And this year's going to be parliamentary elections. So I think what Russia's trying to do in Moldova is influence those elections. It's to try and create a sense of crisis. It's to try and drive up energy prices and to weaken the case for European accession or European membership in Moldova or the European direction. Fortunately, I think because Europe's had 3 years now of Russian trying to influence Europe itself over gas, Europe was much more prepared. So there's much more. I saw the statement of the new High Representative Foreign Affairs of the European Union that there was solidarity with the Moldovan situation, that Europe would help Moldova in this moment of need. Of course, that's going to drive up costs because Moldova had cheap energy from Russia, but Transnistria only has 2 months, maybe perhaps, of gas left, and that the coal-fired power stations won't help it. So there's definitely an issue there, and we'll have to see how it plays out over the winter.
What effect is it already having in Transnistria, and what could it have? What kind of could it actually translate into some unrest in that area?
I sat in Ukraine myself in 2008 when Russia turned the gas off to Kiev and froze, and it's very quick. The effect of reducing or turning off the gas to actually people freezing in terms of heating, in particular electricity, is very immediate. And I think the problem with Transnistria has always been this sort of Russia client state. It's always wanted to do its own thing. It's turned down so far assistance from Moldova to try and supply itself with energy because of its sort of history of tension between Moldova and Transnistria. This was a rebel province. I think the problem is that if the freeze continues, because Russia could provide gas to Transnistria via another route, it's chosen not to. If it carries
via Turkey, wasn't it?
Via Turkey. So if it doesn't supply gas via Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova into Transnistria, then there's a serious chance of humanitarian situation. Do people leave there and move across into Moldova, or do the Russians try to create a sense of crisis that something must be done, blaming the Moldovans? So I think it's something which is going to be, the winter down there lasts another couple of months. It's going to be very difficult if the gas runs out, the gas storage runs out. If they can't provide enough heating and electricity for the people, then there will be an impact. I think there's also an impact on Moldova, because what happens is Moldova shipped gas to Transnistria. Transnistria generate electricity and ship the electricity back into Moldova. So what happens inside Moldova if the alternative sources of electricity don't meet that demand could also have impacts in Moldova. So the only good point, the only positive is that Europe is seized with this issue. It's not being seen as an issue on the a faraway country they care about. Romania cares about it deeply, and so does Europe now. And I think the movement of Moldova towards Europe has actually encouraged Europe to actually step up and help the Moldovans at the moment.
Just to turn to a matter inside Britain, there was a parliamentary debate this week about seizing frozen Russian assets to send to Ukraine. Now, it's not a new debate at all, but it was led by a former British Army officer who argued that there is a clear legal pathway to seize $300 billion worth of assets because of the grievous violations of international law committed by Russia, citing the genocidal abduction of children. Do you agree with that? And do you think the West so far has been too cautious on this issue?
But firstly, I think the West has been cautious generally about Ukraine, arms, political support, sanctions towards Russia, and recognising it as an existential issue which we really need to sort out, that Ukrainian security is our security. So I think, yes, I do agree we could have done more under Biden, and we'll have to see what happens under Trump. I think on the issue of 300 billion, I mean, it's been discussed since it was frozen, and through the G7, European financial ministers, we've discussed it ourselves. The problem with taking 300 billion of Russian assets and giving it to Ukraine or using it for Ukraine's support is what's the effect on the international financial markets. And I think to date, financial ministers have balked on doing that because it creates a precedent. We take 300 billion off the Russians, give it to Ukraine, and then next crisis comes along, you take another 500 billion or 250 billion. It means that there's no trust in the system whatsoever. And what is the effect of doing that on global financial stability, and what happens next time? So, and what happens in the future if at some stage Russia wants to come and turn the page, wants to have a new relationship with the West and says, where's our 300 billion? We'd like it back, please. So I think that gets bogged down into litigation for decades. So I think the approach so far of using the interest on that sum has been right. I think there's more we could do to use the principle, the 300 billion, leverage that for extending loans or whatever it is to Ukraine, but actually taking the whole principal sum, I think it's probably a step too far, and I don't see financial ministers wanting to do that, especially given the state of the global economy at the moment.
You mentioned a phrase, we'll have to see what the Trump administration is going to do. And everyone is guessing what Donald Trump's approach will be towards Ukraine and the war when he takes office. He's been making headline-grabbing statements in recent time. Well, he always has, hasn't he? But he says he understands now Moscow's feelings about having somebody on their doorstep, that a meeting is being arranged between himself and Vladimir Putin saying, we have to get the war over with. And he calls it, I quote, a bloody mess. What at this stage can we take from that kind of rhetoric?
I saw David Lammy interviewed yesterday widely and he said, people say things at press conference, British Foreign Secretary, people say things on press conferences. So they campaign in one way and they govern in another way. And there's a great difference, as we saw in the last Trump administration, of what he said and what he did. And I also noticed what people like the new Secretary of State, Mark Rubio, has been saying, the new National Security Advisor, Admirals General Kellogg, about peace, quote unquote, for Ukraine. And actually their statements about NATO as well. So I feel that Trump has said obviously wants peace. I think he's not alone. I think a lot of European leaders would want peace. I think Ukrainians want peace. I think many Russians want peace as well. But it has to be peace with honour. It can't be just a deal struck over the top of Ukrainian heads after 3 years of war. And looking at what Putin's been saying in his press conference before December about his demands, which remain those which were in Istanbul in 2022, and which he restated in June last year. He's denied President Zelensky's legitimacy. He wants to neuter the Ukrainian army. He wants to do permanent neutrality. He wants veto of security guarantees. He wants to retain all territory plus more territory. He wants all sanctions lifted. He's not really signaling compromise. So on one hand, you have Trump wanting peace, the Americans saying we could come in and do a deal. On the other hand, you have the Russians. Putin's just not really signaling he wants to have a deal at all because he's convinced about the rightness of his cause. So although we might be able to see a peace for territory sort of deal, quote unquote, actually landing that, I think, is be extremely difficult. And whether we see a sort of a temporary ceasefire, perhaps, but there's a great difference between that and the lasting peace. And I think the myth of that peace is easy, it can be done at a stroke of a pen within 100 days is hard to see. I think hard to see myself.
Yeah, that 100-day deadline, which Keith Kellogg, the choice by Trump for special envoy to Ukraine, mentioned and underscored, better than 24 hours, which Donald Trump had been promising earlier. I mean, why would they bother giving that number at all? And does that mean that they will be prepared to impose a deal regardless of what it actually means for Ukraine and how good or bad it is for Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, I think that's, again, Trump has actually been quite quiet about what he actually wants, apart from I want peace, what Trump actually wants. And so what you're seeing, I think everybody's waiting for actually concrete proposals from the Americans, which by law they can't do, the new administration can't do until after January the 20th. So we'll have to see what actually the shape of the quote deal will be. I think 100 days is the sort of normal mark used in American politics since JFK. Everybody likes to have the first 100 days. The new British government did exactly the same thing, what we've achieved the first 100 days. This provides a marker, but 3 months to try and sort a problem which has been on, well, might say between Russia and Ukraine since the 17th century. And in the hot form since 2014, which has been intractable, especially after 3 years of sacrifice, hundreds of thousands of dead, and all the war crimes and the abductions and the rapes and the tortures of Ukrainian people, to try and say that, we're just going to wave a magic pen, it's all going to get sorted out, I think is highly unlikely. But I think the fact the Ukrainians are still in Kursk and the Ukrainians are signaling themselves, they have a voice, they have agency themselves, this is their country. And doing a deal over the top of the Ukrainians with the Russians would be, I think, do a grave disservice to European security. And also do a huge disservice to America's reputation. And I think one thing I saw Americans saying is that Trump wants to project strength, not weakness, and doing a deal, a bad deal over the top of the Ukrainians would be weakness, not strength.
So, being realistic, what can the situation look like in 100 days?
Well, I think what we'll see is they'll see lots of shuttle diplomacy. We'll see a statement perhaps of what the American deal is, visits by various high-profile Americans, discussions with the Russians. But actually, I think what most likely is for me is some sort of cessation of hostilities along the current front line, but trying to land a lasting peace deal without security guarantees for Ukraine is going to be extremely difficult. The people pointing out, Putin's quite happy, like he was after Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, it's just to pause, rebuild his army and carry on westwards in due course. So there has to be security guarantees, whether that's via the United States or whether that's via NATO. And is America willing to provide those security guarantees? And if not, the fighting will continue at some stage in the future.
John Foreman, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.